I want you to picture this. You're walking down a very normal Australian suburb on a very normal street, and you look at a house, nothing special about it, but behind that front door, a person lives there, and that person is pretending so hard that nothing is going wrong with their lives, but they are filled with fear every day about the person that lives with them in the same house. That is the reality of thousands of Australians on a daily basis. And that's the thing about domestic and family violence. It hides in plain sight. It's not always dramatic scenes that people imagine, somebody walking out the door with a wife beater singlet on, smashing someone over the head. That's not what domestic violence looks like all the time. What we are seeing on the ground is that it's normally a quieter, a constant underlying threat that is in the household. It could be constant monitoring, constant criticism. It could be control over money. It could be control over your friendship groups. It could be control as to who you speak to on a daily basis. All of a sudden, family visits become too hard, and this person is shrinking away and nobody notices it's happening. And then sometimes the news forces everybody to notice. For example, a case in 2024, Molly Ticehurst, 28 years old, a childcare worker and a mother. She was found dead in her home in Forbes in regional New South Wales. Her former partner was arrested and charged with her murder. It was also reported that the killing came only weeks after he faced court on other serious allegations relating to her, including rape and intimidation. And as a result of those allegations, we know Molly had reached out to the system, she had contact, and it still wasn't enough to keep her safe. This is just one of many examples of domestic violence that happens in Australia on a yearly basis. All right, I'm Hayder Shikara, an Australian lawyer, and I like to break down legal situations so people understand their rights, and also like to discuss legal topics that happen in Australia. So let's start with the scale of domestic violence in Australia, because it is much bigger than most people realize. Here's what the data tells us. From the age of 15, about 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 14 men have experienced violence by an intimate partner. When you include emotional abuse and economic abuse, millions of Australian adults have experienced some form of partner violence or abuse. So it's not a niche problem. It's something that affects more Australians than people think. Now, why do we have such a problem? And I think it's got a lot to do with this simple statistic, and that is a lot of Australians report witnessing violence from one parent to another during their own childhood. So millions of people, they grew up with violence as part of their background. It was almost normal in a way. It wasn't a one-off incident. It was something that was consistently happening, whether it was constant emotional violence or whether it was physical violence. This was something that shaped the narrative of children for decades in Australia. And as we know, what you see as a child, it reshapes how you think about the world. It teaches children what to expect when it comes to family dynamics, when it comes to conflict, when it comes to love. When you package all of that together and you see that and you witness that as a child, then it becomes really hard to break that cycle and understand that those things that you witnessed are actually not normal, they're wrong. And a common theme that I'm going to be going through this video is about the normality of domestic violence and what people perceive it to be. And that is the fact that you have maybe broken bones or bruises or somebody getting hit. But emotional and economic abuse, they're far more common than people would think. And just to break it down and give some definitions, economic abuse, it can look like somebody that has constant control over things like your pay, your bank account, your spending habits. It could be constantly monitoring what you're spending money on. It could be giving you a set allowance when that is completely unreasonable to kind of manage your own spending on a daily basis. Now that's hard to identify because sometimes it might be part of somebody's budget or somebody's ability to kind of manage their household finances, or there might be other reasons behind it. Maybe one partner is more of a spender than the other and they need to kind of keep them in line. And I kind of understand that, but when does it cross the line of being abusive? And I've seen a lot of these arguments play out in court where one party has said, I've been economically controlled. There's been financial abuse in my relationship. And when you go through it, sometimes it is a fine line to distinguish whether somebody is being abusive here or they're trying to stick to a particular budget, maybe because one person's spending habits are not in line with the other person's spending habits. So yes, it can be a little bit of a fine line to figure out, but There are definitely extreme examples of emotional abuse that we've seen where people have not been able to work, are restricted to a really low, unreasonable amount of money or spending limit, constant monitoring of all of the spending, and emotional abuse if that spending limit is breached. So when it gets to that kind of point, you are talking about economic abuse. Now, the second side of it, which is emotional abuse, again, it's a bit harder to identify. When it comes to physical abuse, you can see the black eyes, you can see the damage to the person's body. But emotional abuse is normally something that's slow and occurs over time. It's a gradual degradation of somebody's character until they feel like that they've been reduced to nothing, that they're no longer an individual. Yes, it can also be outbursts and yelling, and it can be humiliation and threats. Those are the more obvious ones, I guess, if there are witnesses or if there's a recording or something like that. But sometimes it can be a lot more subtle, and that slow degradation over time can also amount to that emotional abuse. And that's where the term coercive control comes into play. It's something that's come up only in the last few years and something that's been discussed and legislated. And the reason why is because there's so many victim survivors that describe this process of dominating someone's life. And that whole system of controlling a person is now what is called coercive control. And unfortunately, Australia has a story that permanently changed the way many people understand and think of coercive control. And that story comes from 2020. Hannah Clark and her 3 children, Alia, Leanna and Trey, they were all killed in Brisbane in an act of horrific domestic violence. In the years since, her family has spoken publicly about coercive control, what it looks like, the constant monitoring, the jealousy that's framed as love, and small restrictions that become a constant build-up over time that ends up putting this person in a prison-like state. This story matters because it demonstrates something that a lot of experts and domestic violence advocates often say, and that is domestic violence, it's not normally a sudden explosion where somebody all of a sudden, without demonstrating a history of coercive control or a pattern of behavior, where they move from not doing any of that to all of a sudden causing huge harm to somebody physically. And we know that people don't just randomly get to a point where they kill their partner, where there hasn't been a long history of abuse beforehand. And the idea behind this legislated coercive control laws is to try and get it before it gets to that point. Instead of waiting until there's an incident where somebody has to be killed in order for somebody to be convicted, the idea is if you can track a pattern of behavior before it gets to that point, then you can prevent it from happening without having to wait until that point. The idea is to stop the worst case outcome, the worst case scenario before it happens. And the worst case scenario is homicide. Right now, the stats show that domestic homicide victims make up a large share of all homicide victims in Australia, and that a substantial proportion of these domestic homicides are committed by intimate partners or ex-intimate partners as well. We know that women are far more likely to be killed by men than a man is to be killed by a woman. That's why we know when you look at all of this data that this isn't a one-off issue or a private issue or a problem with a particular person. We can see it as a public kind of safety crisis because the data shows that these are the people that are in danger in these situations. And sadly, it's not just homicide data, but it's also hospitalization data that captures the more severe physical harm. And the data also matches showing that it's more likely to be a woman than a man. And the largest cause of these women being injured is from being with an intimate partner or an ex-intimate partner. We also know that women are far more likely to reach out. We know we've got a public hotline, 1-800-RESPECT, and in a single year, they track all of the calls, the chats, and the texts that they get. And again, there's a huge skew towards women making these calls and reaching out for help. Now, of course, violence can be experienced by people of all genders, including men, and in all kinds of relationships. But the severity, the frequency, and the outcomes, they're often gendered. And women are far more likely to be seriously harmed by an intimate partner and far more likely to be hospitalized and far more likely to be killed. So if we go back to that case of Molly Ticehurst for a moment, we know that after her death, there was a lot of questions about a failure in the system because she had reached out, she wanted support and help, and the people that were supposed to help her, they didn't. So it sparked a whole renewed call into looking at things like the bail laws, because we know that this person was actually released on bail? And what are the signs that lead towards this event so we can try and capture it before it gets too far? Now, another sad story in 2023, we had Lily James, a really young water polo coach in Sydney. She was killed by a former partner and colleague. It then came to light what the use of technology was to facilitate this abuse and how it escalated, and how behaviors that people could see as quite normal, things like location sharing, getting access to somebody's records on their mobiles or going through their texts, all of those were used as tools of control. And again, there might not have been any incidents of physical injury where people can kind of see it, or if there's records of that. But if there are certain behaviors which can kind of cross the line of being controlling, then we know that that is a pattern that leads to a potential level of abuse later down the line. All of these behaviors, they're normally done to kind of control and to keep somebody under the influence of the other person. And it might be done under the guise of, oh, it's because I love you so much. It's because I need to know where you are. It's because I'm looking out for you and for your safety. Also, a big part of it is making sure that this person doesn't leave them. That's when the biggest risk applies. We know that when somebody tries to separate from their partner, then it all of a sudden can make things escalate, and it can be very dangerous for certain people. And that's why a lot of Australia's current reforms, they're aimed at making leaving possible and making control harder. So you've got things like particular grants to people, so that if they are leaving a violent relationship, they are going to receive a cash grant to go towards their rent, towards funding, purchasing new furniture and things. Something like that is designed to help people leave a domestic violence situation and giving them the ability to fund that next stage of their life, which can also be a really scary time. A lot of people cite the reason as to why they can't leave a relationship is because they don't have that financial support. Their money is a huge barrier. And that's why the federal government has committed substantial investment into establishing the Leaving Violence program. And that's designed to provide the financial support and help people access safety planning and other referrals. If you don't have access to money, you can't leave a relationship. And if you can't leave that relationship, then your danger keeps escalating. Now, one of the biggest things that have been occurring in the legal system is legislating a law against coercive control. And that began in 2024. So New South Wales had that law put in place, and then Queensland followed after. The idea is to kind of pick up the behaviors that occur over time and to investigate these behaviors that often underpin domestic violence and family violence. It's not just a one-off incident, it's normally a pattern. And so if you are able to get it beforehand, that coercive control charge can be used to prevent really ill tragedies from happening. But when you actually think about it, yes, it sounds nice in theory, but gathering the evidence and having a police investigation into how one party treats the other party in the family home. And if you think about the evidence that's kind of required, it is a real difficult process because each kind of incident that is part of coercive control can appear quite small. For example, the Find My iPhone feature. Like if you have that feature on your phone, you can't just go to the police and then say, hey, my partner got angry at me because I turned off Find My feature on my phone. They'll look at you and say, okay, cool, what do you want me to do about that? That's more of an issue between two people. But if you were to combine that with a whole series of things, for example, Find My iPhone, my partner's getting angry when I turn that feature off. There are surveillance cameras maybe in my house, and that's monitoring my movements going in and out of the house. I can't spend money where I want to, and I'm limited to a particular budget when it comes to, weekly groceries. I'm not allowed to speak to my friends and family, and I have to use a monitored phone whenever I'm using that. So when you kind of add all of these things together, then it starts to create this narrative of, yes, you're being controlled. It sounds like you're in an abusive relationship. But I've dealt with police a lot of times. Find me a police officer that's going to have the patience to go through each and every one of those small points, gathering the evidence, gathering the data, and having then the ability to charge a person for coercive control. It is a real major task for a police officer to do that. And I'm not sure if the system can deliver on that. And that's often a problem that we have in Australia. You can legislate something, you can put something in place and make it criminalized, but Do we have the resources to enforce it? Do we have the education, particularly in the police departments, to kind of identify and follow through with it? All of those are separate questions. And the data also shows this. We've had these laws in place for over a year now, and the numbers of charges that have been laid by the police are extremely low. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a failure. I'm hoping that at least by having this criminalized and having people aware that this is now a thing which is illegal, which is coercive control, it might put off particular people from doing those types of behaviors and that build up. It might allow certain conversations in household to kind of occur saying, hold on, this pattern of behavior, these things that you're asking for, it's actually illegal. It might also help friends and family of somebody that's going through this experience to also understand it and research themselves. All of a sudden, this term coercive control, which wasn't really a term that was around 5 years ago, it might be something that's researched, it might be something that's looked at. And if you know somebody that's kind of going through that, they might be saying, hold on, here are a series of behaviors that we're starting to notice between you and your partner. Is there something that we should be worried about? And I think that's where the real power lies. It's not necessarily always with the police and whether the police can enforce something. It's going to be through a cultural awareness through family members, through friends, through the public, through people themselves knowing that this isn't right, this is actually illegal. Now, I want to add one more story to the list of violent incidents that have really shook Australia. And this is the story of Luke Batty. In 2014, Luke Batty was killed by his father at cricket practice in Melbourne. And Rosie Batty, who is Luke's mum, became one of the most prominent national advocates for family violence reforms in Australia as a result of that. That story matters because it shows that the victim survivors of domestic violence offences have a huge burden. First, the emotional burden of having to deal with what occurred in their family. And the second is to push for national reform. And you can see that whenever there is a big incident like this, there is always a push for national reform, and it is done by the victim survivors. So when you have these events that occur, yes, they can be tragic, they can be horrific events, but what often happens is we push for reforms that they might not always be perfect at the time, but they are done in the hopes that we can prevent these from happening. The reality is with domestic violence, we're never going to have a clear slate where we have 0 deaths in a year in relation to domestic violence. It's always going to happen. You can't stop these incidents, even one-off incidents, because the family unit, it's private, it's intimate, and people aren't able to get access to it to understand completely what's going on. But as a country, we can put reforms in place to definitely lower those numbers, to keep people safer, to help people identify these problems before they get to the final problem. I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction. We can definitely see that these numbers are being reduced over time, so that is a good thing. And there's a lot more awareness as to what is domestic violence. It's not just the physical, but it's also the other things that make up to it that kind of may lead to that physical final incident, which we want to prevent. All right, so now I'll put it back to you guys. What do you think Australia is missing most right now when it comes to helping this domestic violence crisis? Is it got to do with maybe stronger laws, bail laws? It could be something to do with financial support, housing potentially for victims. Drop a comment below. And if you want to follow our video, let me know what you want to hear next. I do read the comments. And if you did enjoy this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next one.